Know your dealer has been a drug culture safety standard forever. As cannabis migrates towards whatever potential legalization the future holds, one of the few but important advantages of the licensed cannabis market is the availability of analytics. It is very helpful to know which cannabinoids are dominant in cannabis products, how potent they are, what terpenes are present, and that they are devoid of dangerous pesticides, molds, and heavy metals. This is a modern equivalent of Know Your Dealer. We could do a whole episode on gaming cannabis analytics to cheat, but on the whole, having cannabis analytics available to us is an important modern win for cannabis patients and enthusiasts alike. Psychedelic mushrooms are following in the footsteps of cannabis in so many ways. And because cannabis has already laid the groundwork for mushroom legalization, many states are rushing to develop legal frameworks, healthcare standards, and manufacturing rules. Similarly, we have begun to recognize the importance of analytical labs for mushrooms too. All mushrooms are not created equal, and as patients, enthusiasts, and product developers all have increased access to psilocybin mushrooms, the importance of knowing what we are ingesting becomes hugely important. If you want to learn about cannabis health, cultivation, and technique efficiently and with good cheer, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We'll send you new podcast episodes as they come out, delivered right to your inbox, along with commentary on a couple of the most important news items from the week and videos too. Don't rely on social media to let you know when a new episode is published. Sign up for the updates to make sure you don't miss an episode. Also, we're giving away very cool prizes to folks who are signed up to receive the newsletter. There's nothing else you need to do to win except receive that newsletter, so go to shapingfire.com to sign up for the newsletter and be entered into this month's and all future newsletter prize drawings. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I'm your host, Shango Los. My guest today is Dr. George Sellhorn. George Sellhorn PhD is founder and principal scientist at Flourish Labs in Portland, Oregon. Flourish is one of the first labs in the U.S. to provide analysis of psilocybin mushrooms. He has also been lab director at Rose City Labs, a cannabis and environmental analytics lab. George has 22 years of experience with liquid chromatography, both preparative and analytical. He's worked in HIV vaccine development as well as cancer and autoimmune disorder drug development. His PhD in molecular plant sciences with an emphasis in biochemistry is from Washington State University. On today's episode, we're going to get up to speed on psilocybin analytical labs because they are about to become incredibly relevant, just like cannabis labs have. During set 1, we will look closely at the components of mushrooms and get a better understanding of what we are looking for specifically. During the second set, we will talk about prevention of bad actors gaming the system and trying to cheat like folks do in cannabis labs, along with some of the mechanics of mushroom sampling. And during this third set, we're going to talk about mushroom storage at home and specific varieties of potent mushrooms. Welcome to Shaping Fire, George.
Thank you very much, Shango. I'm super excited to be here.
Right on. Well, thank you for bringing your rare skill set to us because we're excited to talk about it. So, by now, most of us understand that with cannabis analytics, we are looking for potency of a range of cannabinoids and terpenes to help us understand the potency of our flower. And what we're curious to start with is what are the constituents of psilocybin mushrooms that we want to measure?
It is very similar. We are looking at a potency measure when we're looking at the biomass of mushrooms or an extract, for example. There are alkaloids in mushrooms, in the psilocybin mushrooms that are our target, as opposed to the cannabinoids and terpenoids in cannabis. And there are 5 primary ones. There's 2 that most people know about, which are psilocin and psilocybin. And then there's 3 additional ones, norpsilocin, baeocystin, and norbaeocystin. These are the 5 primary ones that people look for. There's also an additional 6th analyte called arginacine, which can also be found in the psilocybin mushrooms, and that's actually, so 6 total, but 5 that people mostly look at. And then I have a feeling people are going to be more interested in arginacine going forward. I've heard a couple people talk about a hypothesis that they think that might be responsible for some of the wood lover mushroom issues, like there's toxins from wood lover mushrooms that can make people sick. So and that's actually a pretty good segue into why we're doing this. The main reason is safety. That's why I'm interested in doing this. Is these molecules are quite powerful and have the ability to influence the way people think quite substantially. So with this being introduced to a whole new group of people with the legalization of psilocybin in Oregon, we want to make sure people are safe.
So these other metabolites, I feel actually quite rookie about this because, I'm familiar with psilocin and psilocybin, but the other, 4 that you mentioned, like I've never heard of any of them. You mentioned one of them that, it can be toxic. So I'm guessing that
I don't know for sure if it's toxic, but I've heard a couple people mention that they think that might be involved. So yeah, I don't know for sure.
Okay, cool. Thank you for the correction. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Yeah.
For sure, there's a lot of unknowns here in this industry and in this topic. It's been in the dark for so long, being a Schedule I substance, that people weren't allowed to do this research for a very long time. But thanks to organizations like MAPS and people like Rick Doblin, they've opened up the ability for us to start looking at these things again, which actually happened way back in the 60s. So
these other constituents are other than psilocin and psilocybin. Are those for all things that we are trying to analyze and get potency for because we want to encourage them, because we think that they are, like perhaps helper molecules for psilocybin or something, or are the other 4 really more things that we want to track for potential negative reasons?
Well, for the norpsilocin, baeocystin, and norbaeocystin, I know that people are definitely interested in them as psychedelic molecules. I do not believe there's major toxicity associated with those in larger doses. They're more minor alkaloids in the mushroom compared to psilocybin and psilocin, and they're not found in every species either. I've definitely seen baeocystin and norbaeocystin in some samples from customers, but I have yet to see norpsilocin show up. So, and some of these molecules, convert into each other. Psilocybin converts into psilocin, and all of these molecules are very similarly related structurally.
It reminds me right away of the entourage effect in cannabis, and
indeed,
good. So that's what I'm curious about. Do you think that? And again, I know we're very early in this research, but do you think we're going to find that these different constituents are working together, or do you think that they just happen to sometimes co-occur?
Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to believe that they don't have some sort of synergy or interaction with each other, because you can make the analogy to cannabis where you look at CBD and THC, for example. They don't bind to the same receptors. That's why they have different effects in the body. And while we know the target for psilocin and psilocybin, we may not know all the target receptors for the other constituents, and we might not even know if psilocin and psilocybin touch other receptors either. There's the experiments that are done in order to figure this stuff out are pretty complicated and involve binding kinetics with the analyte and the receptor, and it takes a great deal of work to figure out. And then you also, when you have lower affinity, or what I mean by that is like the interaction between the receptor and the molecule is not very high, it's like really low, those can be actually hard to discover that they're binding to in the cell or on the cells. So it takes even more extensive work to discover the minor receptors that they might interact with.
Wow, that's really interesting. All right, so I know for me, the 4 that you mentioned, other than psilocin and psilocybin, were all new to me. But to people who are studying at your level and understand these mushrooms intimately, are you expecting there to be some or many more constituents of the mushrooms that we discover and find out are things that we do want to analyze? Is so this is the number of things we were going to be looking for in these assays is expanding as we learn more.
Exactly. Yeah, there is some work going on in Israel where they have a very advanced lab where where they use a different technique than we use in Flourish to look at these analytes. They're using a mass spectrometry, and with a liquid chromatography coupled with a mass spectrometer, you can identify molecules that are super low abundance. maybe 1,000-fold more sensitive than the HPLC UV that I'm using to do these quantitative analytics. And I know that they've discovered a host of new molecules in psilocybin mushrooms that is in the literature and just really isn't well known at all. And then what you need to do then is single out these molecules and then do experiments with each of them. And this is a very massive effort. And, one of the biggest deficiencies I have right now is in this field is the time to dive really deep into the literature of basic research. Most of my work right now is involved with researching method development because I'm setting up additional tests outside of psilocybin mushrooms, which we can talk about later if you're interested, or maybe next time. But most of my time is spent developing new tests for the lab, so I'm a little bit deficient on the newest alkaloids coming out of these mushrooms, but that's actually something we could probably talk about in a single episode if you're ever interested in the future.
It's really interesting to experience how much opportunity that there is in mushrooms right now. For somebody who sees themselves as an organic chemist or a naturalist scientist, to the idea that there's all these species to discover, and then there's all these species to then do experimentation within the lab, and then of course how they're interacting with the human. Like what a time to be somebody early career who is interested in this.
Yeah, actually, I have two answers to that question. First of all, you said additional species. So right now I've been talking mostly about the psilocybe mushrooms. And one thing that I thought was really interesting too is I've even seen a reference where people have found bufotenin in the mushrooms. Wow. That's the same one found in the toad, right? That's a really powerful DMT molecule. That's another reference I'd need to follow up and verify, but I thought that was super interesting. But for other species, there are like Gymnopolis and Foliota. There are these molecules called bisnoragonin, hispidin, and then in Amanita, there's muscimol, ibotenic acid, and muscazone. So there's a host of other molecules that can be looked into as well, So just narrowing down on the psilocybe mushrooms is super interesting, but there's also a lot more out there. And to be honest, when we're talking about the fungal kingdom, there is so much we don't know. I mean, unbelievable amount of information out there to be mined by people to figure out what's going on with these absolutely incredible organisms.
So I know that the few labs that there are for mushrooms in the United States, they look different and they're run different. But I'm going to ask you like a real general question from your experience, just kind of about all labs in general, which is, do you think that mostly labs are being set up at this point just for psilocybe, or do you think that both part of their business model to be able to have a more variety of customers, but also the direction that interest is going? Would you say that most labs are setting themselves up for the Amanita and all these these other mushrooms that are coming into popularity again?
Yeah. Well, first of all, most people are going to be handcuffed by their laws. So it's only legal to mess with any of these in very few places in the country. The state of Oregon, Denver, Oakland, and maybe I have heard of a lab in Michigan, but I don't know if they're just doing it without having the laws changed yet. And there's a couple levels of this answer here. So to set up the testing for psilocybin and psilocin, it's not that difficult. There's information out there in the literature. You don't need a tremendous amount of equipment, $20,000, $30,000 investment, and you could get going. Now, having the ability to do analytical method development and develop methods for things that there might not be a lot of information out there is going to be a real challenge for anyone that doesn't have a massive amount of experience in chromatography method development with HPLC or LCMS. What I've noticed is several of the labs that are up and running, there's only a few, most of the people doing it are very young scientists, and by young I don't mean they're physiological age, but the amount of experience they have with this type of work. And the less experience you have doing this, the more difficult it is to expand into different species or different tests. And I've been doing chromatography method development for 20 years. It's kind of funny. I just recently announced that I can test for cordycepin, and I got some cordyceps mushrooms from a guy on Instagram, collaborated with. He gave me some material to help develop my method, and I had this guy's mushroom and an extract for, it must have been 2 months, and I've just been so busy in my day job and all the other things involved. I'm a parent, I'm a father, I'm a husband, and I just didn't have time to get to it. And then just last weekend, I developed a method for cordyceps in 2 days. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of people are not going to have the base knowledge to do something like that so quickly, and then validating the method and making sure it's correct. It takes a lot more work after you develop it to make sure that it's correct. And we can have really challenging issues where two different molecules have what's called the same retention time. And what that means is when you have a complex molecule, say I do an extraction of a mushroom, and then I put it through my machine, we use a column that is packed with a bed of what's called resin, which is basically a bed of a bead that has a chemical functional group or a chemistry interactive group on the surface of the molecule. We take our complex mixture of mushrooms and we pass it through that column, and all the molecules in the mixture interact with the surface of that column resin in a different way. This is how they start to separate out and resolve from each other. Mm-hmm. And so when you put a sample on a column, you can have stuff come out within a couple minutes, 5, 10, 15, maybe even 20 minutes, to even longer, depending on how fast the flow is and how much interaction occurs between the molecule of interest and the resin bed of the column. So these retention times is how you distinguish which molecule is which, because if you do everything the exact same way every time, they should come out to the same retention time within 0.05 minutes of each other, within seconds. They should be very reproducible. Now, if we have two molecules that are almost identical, for example, psilocin and psilocybin, is a very subtle change where psilocybin loses a phosphate group, which is a phosphorus and 4 oxygens. And when you do that, you actually get a pretty big change in the physiological behavior or the chemical behavior of the molecule, and then you get these to separate very easily. And then with cordyceps, you're actually looking at molecules where it's as subtle of a change of a hydrogen and an OH group, so a hydroxyl to a hydrogen, and everything else on the molecule is identical. So separating those when there's such a subtle change is critical, right? Because you don't want to tell people you're testing cordycepin, but it's actually that peak also has either adenosine or 2-deoxyadenosine, right? You'll be giving them the wrong information. So you have to make sure that with your method development that you have all your controls in place and all your standards separating at what is called a baseline resolution, so that you can actually quantitate or give people the concentration of these analytes in their mushrooms.
Right on. That was a very clear explanation. And, I've talked about this before when I was talking to Dr. Miyabi Shields on this show, but I really like, the artisan approach, where by creating these lab processes, right, you're inventing your own tools. My grandpa and my uncles, they were all carpenters, and I remember when I was a kid, the first time that I realized that they needed to do something in carpentry, and so they actually developed and made a tool because that tool didn't exist. And the idea that you could invent tools was fascinating to me as a kid. It still is cool to me. Yeah. And that's essentially, what you're describing is that, all right, we've got this new box of information called mushrooms, and we need to come up with tools to be able to open this box uniquely. And I get pretty jazzed by that. Let's talk about terpenes. I've only really understood that there have been terpenes in mushrooms for about 3 years after it came up unexpectedly during an interview. And so, since that time, I have been trying to learn everything I can about mushroom terpenes. They seem to be incredibly subtle. They certainly don't play as big of a role to humans as an aroma attractant as they do in our favorite plant, cannabis. But all of the mushroom research I'm talking about saying they're like, these terpenes are going to be a bigger deal than we take them for now. And so I would like to hear what you have to say about the terpene, are you testing for mushroom terpenes? Are there a few that are particularly common? And in your conversations with your customers, do you have any, status quo of where we're at as far as understanding the role that terpenes play in these mushrooms?
Your last question is the easiest one to answer, and the role that these terpenes are playing, for the most part, we have no clue. This is a brand new area of research. I mean, there might be a couple labs around the world that would disagree with me and say they know more, and they probably do, but these are kind of obscure, and I don't really know too much about them. I'm definitely not an expert in mushroom terpenes because they're so new, and one thing I'd like to say is they're very different from the cannabinoid terpenes. As you said, cannabinoid terpenes are typically associated with odor and providing us with that beautiful profile that we get from all the diversity in the cannabis plants. The terpenes found in mushrooms are generally called triterpenes, so they're much larger and they're more complex often than the ones we know about in cannabis, and they do not have odors associated with them because they're not as volatile, if they're volatile at all. And they're found in some species and not others. For example, the reishi mushroom has a large group of triterpenes that are people are very interested in, and they are much more complicated to test for. Right now, like, first of all, getting standards for them can be a challenge. Most people that are going to be looking at terpenes are going to be using mass spectrometry, which these machines are very expensive, and Flourish is definitely planning on buying one in the near future so that I can expand into these more lower abundant molecules and ones that you might not be able to find authentic reference standards for, because using a mass spectrometer, you don't always need a reference standard. Well, you don't need a reference standard to identify things. There's these databases that you can pay enormous amounts of money to have access to, and you can basically find just about any molecule that we know exists that way. If you want to use a mass spectrometer to quantitate, then you definitely need reference standards. So, but I have a feeling that these terpenes, these triterpenes from mushrooms, are going to be really important. I have a feeling that they're going to be critical in the bioactivity and the medicinal properties of these mushrooms. I believe there's also some found in turkey tail and definitely in lion's mane as well. And some of these other mushrooms, they also have these unique compounds associated with them that aren't found in other species, like these aranacines and what's the name of the other group of compound? Aranacines and hercinones from lion's mane. There are these incredibly unique diterpenoids from the mycelium of lion's mane, and also one's in the mycelium, I believe that's the aranacine, and I believe the hercinones are more abundant in the fruiting body. And Paul Stamets has talked about these quite a bit on various podcasts he's been on, and these are responsible for neurogenesis. I don't know that I should say that. I know there's a very strong hypothesis that these things are helping, in vivo in humans. There's definitely in vitro work showing that these lion's mane compounds actually initiate neurogenesis. And if Paul Stamets has also referred to other work that shows when you combine psilocybin and lion's mane neurogenesis. And also another thing that he's I just hit the mic. Another thing that he led on to on one of the Joe Rogan podcasts years ago is the combination of these two molecules, and then you add in niacin, or vitamin B3. And what niacin is, a vasodilator, and it can dilate the very... it dilates all blood vessels, right? But if you think about where you need these molecules to work, if someone is dealing with neuropathy from diabetes or from some, traumatic injury, and we want to get the psilocybin and the lion's mane molecules to the absolute depths of the periphery of our circulatory system. These are the capillaries, all the deep parts of our brain, like where the neurogenesis is needed, where the neurodegradation has occurred. Mm-hmm. And by combining all these together, you're going to get a stronger response by the combination of the erinacines and hercinones with the psilocybin, and then using something like niacin to push these molecules to the absolute end of the circulatory system where they're most needed. And so I think that's just absolutely fascinating. And what actually precipitated the beginning of Flourish Labs was I was thinking about making a supplement with lion's mane and niacin, and then letting people get their own psilocybin. But then all these laws changed, and I thought about making this as a product. And then I had a couple of friends say, I think you should make a testing lab, which I need to shout out both of those people. A couple of really good friends. One's been my friend since college. Jeffrey, thank you so much for pushing me towards this lab. And then another guy that he's worked with and I've become friends with, a guy named Drew. And I want to thank both of those guys a lot, because without them I probably wouldn't be here right now. I would have missed the boat.
So let's come at the mushroom from a different direction. Oh, before we do that, I wanted to just jump on the niacin bit. We've talked about niacin and microdosing on the show here a couple times, and you're the first person who explained why niacin is in the stack. So
right.
So thank you for explaining that. That's really a valuable insight. So
there's actually something really interesting about that as well. Niacin, if you take too much, you can get what's called a niacin flush.
I have done this.
Yeah, it's not fun, not super dangerous, but not fun. And so one of the cool things about using niacin in this context is you can prevent people from taking a whole bunch of, not that you don't want to be the psilocybin police, but by putting niacin in the microdose, you're not going to take too many, because you're going to get a niacin flush way before you start tripping. And if you want to have a macrodose, just grab 5 grams of some good mushrooms and go for it.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, so that once they are on store shelves, it decreases the likelihood that people are going to take their whole bottle of
exactly.
microdose at the same time. Yeah.
For jurisdictions that are worried about this, that are more conservative, it might be a really good thing, because there are molecules you could add in there that will dilate your blood vessels without the niacin flush. There's some peptides and some other molecules, small molecules, that'll do that.
Right on. So let's talk about adulterants, right? So, again, most of us have got cannabis analytics as our framework in our head. And in addition to like the cannabinoids and the terpenes that we want, we're also, especially in the licensed system, looking at molds and heavy metals and like just, chemicals from like Eagle 20 and things like this. Mushrooms are not grown the same way as plants, of course. So from your perspective, what substances might we be searching for in mushrooms in the lab that would suggest that they were perhaps grown incorrectly or in an unclean environment, which would cause us to reject batches of mushrooms? I don't know what that would be, but I'm assuming there are.
I'm not a mushroom grower. I never have grown mushrooms, so I'm a little bit uneducated here. The cool thing about mushrooms, if you screw it up, my understanding is a lot of times you don't get anything. Like if you get a contamination, a lot of times the contamination will outrun the mushrooms that you're growing, so you basically just have to throw it out. I'm sure there are situations where people are growing with maybe substrates that might have heavy metals in them, or substrates that might be contaminated with some sort of organism that would be unhealthy for us. And so I absolutely plan on instituting this type of testing at Flourish Labs as well. I believe when it comes time for the regulated legal testing under 109, you will be looking for contaminants like heavy metals and bacteria or other fungi that could be dangerous to humans that might be slow growing. And we'll use a PCR genetic test to determine these things, which is really pretty straightforward, not difficult to do, and going to be critical, again, because you're basically making a food, right, or a medicine for somebody that they're going to ingest in their body, and it has to be clean.
Right on. So let's get back to the analytics. So I understand that one of the things that are interesting about mushrooms is that not only do they have common constituents that are just used in and applied in novel ways in fungus, but also there are some constituents that don't occur very often except in mushrooms. And the type of labs that we're almost familiar with, they're using chemical standards for these constituents, and then using the technology compare against the standard to then figure out how much of it is in any particular mushroom. I'm
Right.
guessing that since the psilocybe mushroom is still a Schedule 1 at the federal level, that some of these standards might actually be challenging to get your hands on. But I'm willing to be open to the fact that maybe they all already exist and it's just been access to them for years and years. So tell us a little bit about how difficult standards are to be able to obtain to do the work.
Yes, this is one of the most common questions I get from people, and you'd be surprised how easy it is. So there's a philosophy here that is pretty straightforward. So these molecules, you have to take a certain dose, right? And so in order to get the standards, you contact these chemical companies, and they basically have 1 milligram per milliliter solutions that you can buy. They're DEA exempt, because you're paying anywhere from $70 to a few $100s for a single milligram. Nobody's going to be abusing these things. You can go down the street and find them for way cheaper, right? So they're DEA exempt when it's a milligram or less, and they're often in solvents you would never put in your body. So it's too much of a hassle to try to get these and abuse them. It's super expensive, and no one would ever do it. That's why they're DEA exempt. Now, if you go trying to buy 5 grams, or you try gram more than, or you're trying to buy a powder, then you need a DEA license. But just for single milligram, 1 mg per mil reference standards, all you need is a legitimate laboratory. And by legitimate laboratory, when you start a company like this, or you have a laboratory you're starting in a nonprofit or in a university, the companies vet your location. Mm-hmm. Like, you can't have a mail service. You need a legitimate commercial laboratory location for them to even send them to you. So that's where the level of regulation comes in by the actual chemical companies. They won't just sell them to anybody also.
Right on, cool. All right, so let's talk about sampling. As we all know, people game the system all the time in cannabis by which flowers they choose to send to the lab. Maybe they're just sending colas, or maybe they'll roll the flower in keef first, or whatever they're going to do. It's not a representative sample, which scientifically is actually quite a process of having a large lot all the way down to a small lot, but when you're done, mathematically, it's representative of the entire lot. When it comes to mushrooms, though, I don't know what a sampling process is like. And so does it matter which mushrooms you pick? Like, can you game the system by sending like a larger or a smaller one? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So one of the most interesting things about these mushrooms to me is the variability of the alkaloid content from flush to flush, from mushroom to mushroom, and also within the mushrooms themselves. So I believe it's going to be a lot harder to adulter them than with cannabis for a couple reasons. We can get to that in a moment. But I had a customer interested in looking at the various structural aspects of the mushroom. And so when the mushrooms are growing, the way that they grow, the cap and the stem appear fused for a really long time. And some mushrooms have a veil, which is like a little skirt around the cap that attaches to the stalk. And then when that opens, then the spores are able to drop from the mushroom cap. Now, I've been told by growers that, and also seeing research in the literature, where most likely the most potent time to harvest is just before the caps open and the veils open, so everything's closed up. However, if you look even more carefully, I had a customer section the mushroom from the bottom of the stem up to the tip of the cap, where we looked at the lower part of the stem, and we looked at the stem and the junction of the stem and the cap right there. So he took about, a half a centimeter to the right of the stalk side, and about a half a centimeter to the right of the left of the cap, and he sliced that, and then he took the top of the cap. And when we looked at that centerpiece where the veil connected to the stalk and the cap was by far the most potent part of the mushroom.
Whoa, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, like twofold more potent than the cap, and maybe 2.5 to 3 times more potent than the stem.
That's a really funny answer, because everybody argues about whether or not stems or caps are the most potent, but actually it's where they join.
Well, in that instance, definitely, because I've also seen just recently a guy on Instagram showed that the stalk was more potent than the cap. And so this opens up a whole host of questions around mushroom cultivation, right? So we've learned a ton about steering plants to produce molecules, cannabis with THC or CBD, other plants, that to produce compounds of interest for pharmaceutical or industrial purposes. I'm really interested to see if we can do this with fungi. And once these growers get out of the basements and closets and start making these commercial facilities, and they're able to control their environments with really high level, man, I'm missing out a lot of words today. I totally apologize.
It's all good.
High fidelity control of their environment. They can tune it up or down a couple degrees, a couple percent humidity. They control CO2, oxygen levels, light, dark. When the mushroom growers get these tools, are they going to be able to produce highly consistent batches? They might. Well, they might not also, because maybe the mushrooms control this in a way we don't understand. I did briefly read an abstract of a paper last night where they claimed that they could influence the alkaloids in the mushrooms by growth conditions. So it's definitely possible. It's just going to take a massive effort of research and development on the mushroom growers' parts to normalize cultivation, so that people that are producing products can grab a batch from the same grower every time and know more or less that their product is going to come out the way they expect. Now, if this is not the case, it's really good news for labs like myself, because if they have a consistent batch every time, you don't necessarily have to test every batch of raw material before you make a product, right? But if you're varying more than 10% of your raw material batches, they're going to have to test every batch so they know how to make their product. So then I would be able to be testing pre-product formation, and then I would be testing their products as well. So for the growers and the product and the producers and people making product, I hope that they can normalize the grow and get consistent batches. It will just help them save a lot of money, and the testing, we're going to be there. We're going to be required to test everything before it hits the shelves, if there ever is retail, or before it hits the clinic, before it's given to patients. So, our niche is there. but we're definitely available to help if that is the case where they need pre and post testing.
Right on. So let's go ahead and take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to continue down the same vein and talk about testing mushrooms that have been dried or fresh. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is biochemist George Sellhorn. And without these advertisers, Shaping Fire would not happen. So please support them and let them know you heard them on Shaping Fire. There are a lot of good people launching new businesses in cannabis, psilocybin, and other psychedelics, and it's a very strange time for us. In the same moment that psilocybin mushrooms are illegal at the federal level, they are becoming increasingly legal in states across the country. These businesses leading the way into the future of plant medicines require specialized legal representation by attorneys who have depth not only in litigation, mergers, and acquisitions, but also in psychedelic and other plant medicines. Green Light Law Group has been empowering cannabis businesses since 2014, and as the market has diversified into psilocybin and other plant medicines, Green Light has been right there, evolving with their diverse clients to provide legal expertise with a high level of legal acumen, creative strategy, and precision that comes with an intimate and specific understanding of both business law and plant medicine. If you are a business owner trying to navigate the layered local and national drug laws on your own, you are at risk of fumbling. These confusing and quickly changing laws complicate everything. Green Light Law Group is ready to help you when hit with a lawsuit, or because you were shafted by a vendor or business partner, or simply because you want to stay legal and could use some preventative guidance before cultivating a controlled substance as an entrepreneur. Green Light Law Group is a collection of folks who care profoundly about their work, and I know this is true because I know the folks from Green Light. There is a huge difference between a big legal firm who has decided to start representing a few drug companies versus working with a collection of high-integrity, passionate lawyers who are personally interested in new plant medicines and firmly believe in their power to heal. Contact Green Light Law Group today and learn more about the services they can offer your industry-leading cannabis or psychedelics company. That's Green Light Law Group at greenlightlawgroup.com. Once you've discovered the benefits of using cannabis, it's a very small step to start making your own edibles, gummies, lotions, tinctures, and concentrated oils at home. Magical Butter has been helping cannabis consumers become self-sufficient for over a decade. With the easy-to-use Magical Butter countertop botanical extractor, you can create high-quality cannabis products to your exact specifications at a fraction of the cost of store-bought edibles. I talk a lot on this show about the importance of home growing so you don't have to rely on others to feel healthy. Well, the Magical Butter machine can empower your personal health by putting you in control of how you use cannabis in your daily life. I've been making my own butters and oils on the stove for years, and I much prefer the ease of using the Magical Butter machine. I just set it and walk away. With the simple touch of a button, the Magical Butter machine grinds, heats, stirs, and steeps your herbal extract, all at the correct time interval and temperature for the perfect infusion every time. As a result, you achieve your desired infusion easily, safely, and consistently. Check out the Magical Butter Instagram to see the machine in action. And don't feel like you have to go it alone. There is a huge community on Facebook called Magical Butter Users United, sharing recipes and best practices so you can learn at your own pace from others who are already doing it successfully. Now is the time to get your own Magical Butter machine and save money while enjoying cannabis. Use the discount code SHAPINGFIRE, one word, no caps, to get 10% off. Visit magicalbutter.com today. There are so many seed banks nowadays that you really have options in who to choose. Not only that, if you pick the wrong seed bank, you could be in for a really sketchy ride. And that's only one of the reasons I recommend Hembra Genetics collection to my friends and listeners who are looking for a seed bank. That's Hembra, spelled Hembra. Hembra is not just another seed bank. Hembra is a woman-operated boutique cannabis genetics provider that only sells thoughtfully curated seeds from the top names in cannabis breeding. With over 50 breeders and over 500 strains to choose from, you will certainly find something you'll love. Hembra Genetics has something for everyone with over 350 feminized strains, 200 regular varieties, and over 100 autoflowers to choose from. Names you know you can trust like Humboldt Seed Company, Night Owl, Canorado, In-House Genetics, Fast Buds, and Gnome Automatics. We both know that there are other seed banks who will take your money but have no customer service. I invited Hembra to advertise on Shaping Fire after hearing so many good stories about them from my friends. They have A-plus customer service with lightning fast response times. In most cases, Helene and Caitlin will get your order out the same day you place it, and you'll usually receive your seeds in just a few days. Most seed banks are simply not this organized or interested in getting your seeds to you this fast. But Hembra cares. You even get free seeds with every order. Helene and Caitlin get it. They have been in the cannabis growing scene for over a decade. So save a few bucks by using this discount code too. Use the code SHAPINGFIRE, all one word, at checkout to save 10% off your order. Buy seeds from good folks who will get you great seeds reliably every time. Visit HembraGenetics.com today. That's Hembra Genetics. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I am your host, Shango Los, and my guest today is biochemist George Sellhorn. So during the first set, we talked a lot about what is actually in mushrooms in general, but specific psilocybe that we want to test for. And then we talked a bunch about the things that might be in mushrooms that we don't, that we want to test for, that we don't want to have in there. Let's talk a little bit more about the mushroom itself and getting it prepped for the analytics. Do mushrooms always have to be dried first to test, or can we test them fresh? And can we only compare fresh tests against fresh tests, or can we compare fresh tests against dry tests because the water aspect doesn't matter?
Yes, we can absolutely test wet or dry mushrooms. Dry mushrooms are a little easier to homogenize than a wet mushroom, but it's totally possible. And we control for moisture. We do dry weight measurements in the end. So basically, if I were to get a dried mushroom from a batch and a wet mushroom from a batch, what I would do is homogenize both individually, and then you weigh out a sample, and then you extract it and you do the HPLC and you get your numbers. And then I always ask for a little bit extra. You need a portion of mushroom to do the analytics on, and you need a portion of the mushroom to dehydrate so you can get the true dry weight. So even when I get a dried mushroom from a customer, I will take a small bit of it, and I basically have a little dehydrating oven that will completely dry it out. I use 104 degrees, so it's not too hot. And it doesn't matter, right? Because I'm not actually testing the part that you dehydrate. You pull out a sample first to do the testing, so it doesn't get any heat treatment, light, or oxidative degradation. And just at the end, all you do is a math adjustment to adjust for the loss of water, just like in cannabis. So it doesn't matter what the water content is. You can compare any mushroom as long as you fully dehydrate a sample and calculate the dry weight percentage.
Typically, how much of a sample in dry weight, because I'm figuring dry is almost 100% of what everybody's using.
Yeah.
But how big of a sample do you think a lab is going to request most of the time? Because same thing in cannabis, having a little bit extra is helpful, especially if something comes up and
goes wrong and you have to retest.
Yeah, exactly. So what do samples volumes or sizes look like for mushrooms?
So for me, I prefer 2 grams. 2 grams is plenty for me. I've seen other labs ask for 3, 4, and 5 grams, which in my humble opinion is a little bit excessive. But for the way I do it is I get 2 grams from a customer, and typically most people are fully dehydrating these things themselves. I would say an average air dried mushroom has about 10% moisture. but most of the ones that I'm getting from people only have about 1% moisture. So they're fully dehydrating them before I get them. So I usually make a very small dry weight adjustment. But yeah, 2 grams is plenty for me. I keep 1 gram for the dehydration step, and I keep 1 gram for analytics, because for the analytics I use about 250 to 350 milligrams. So that gives me at least 2 tests, 2 extractions, that if I had to extract their sample twice, then I have plenty for the extractions and plenty for the dehydration.
One of the challenges that was very common with labs at the beginning of licensed cannabis was testing edibles, because it's so much more difficult to target in on the cannabinoids when you've got, God knows what else is in this brownie. Is it uniquely more difficult to find mushroom metabolites in chocolate or other edibles? Because, chocolates and honeys and gummies seem to be the 3 ways that mushroom edibles are first coming to market.
Right. So there's an interesting chemistry problem here, and it's both in cannabis and in mushroom stuff. So real quickly on cannabis, we know that the cannabinoids are fat soluble. They're hydrophobic molecules, which is why it's really easy to make a chocolate bar with cannabis, because it has a bunch of fat in it. Whereas it's way more difficult to make a consistent gummy, because you're putting a hydrophobic molecule into a water-based product, a gummy. Now, we flip this when we go to the mushrooms. It's super easy to make really consistent gummies. All the gummies that I've tested from people have been really consistent. And then flip that, the chocolate bar, and now you're trying to put a water-soluble molecule into a fat-soluble product. So the consistency in the chocolate bar is more challenging with an alkaloid than a terpene from cannabis. And I test for both. I have methods for edibles, extracts, and fruiting bodies, so I can do all of those things. I think this is the only lab in the country doing edibles, but I'm not positive. I haven't seen advertisements for anybody else doing edibles.
Well, that certainly explains why I'm seeing the growth in mushroom gummies and gelatin-based stuff. Traditionally, chocolates have been incredibly popular, but if the homogenization is a problem, that's a big deal breaker as far as consistency. And as we all know, from
especially with a psychedelic.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And as we know, like during the transition from the heritage market to the medicinal market, the semi-legal medicinal market, and then a licensed market in cannabis, that the biggest reason to go in that direction is for consistency for patients, right?
Right.
And we're climbing that same mountain now with mushrooms, trying to figure out what's the best way to create repeatable results for patients, because that's the only reason for legalization in my, or not legalization, but licensing, because I don't really believe that the state should be involved with licensing or taxing this at all. But sure. I do like the idea of there being consistency in the products, because in the end, my number one priority is patients. So that makes some sense why the gummies are kind of everywhere now.
Yeah. And there's a downside to these edible things too. Like, sugar is such a huge problem in this Western culture, and everybody wants to put it in this sweet candy. It's not the best route for medicine, in my opinion.
Yeah,
right?
I'm with you on that. That's why I've pushed tinctures as a great primary thing, because with capsules you're kind of for cannabis anyway. With cannabis capsules, you're going to have a whole bunch that are exactly the same, and there's no variability from day to day. And then all these people are eating all these 10 milligram cookies, and that's not necessarily great for patients either. Yeah,
right. So with mushrooms, it's great, right? Because it's water soluble. We could make teas and beverages without sugar. You could even make a concentrate into a few milliliters. You could make like a shot size and just boom, right there. Because it's so easy to get these alkaloids into water. They're water soluble. And there's actually a really interesting thing I'd like to add here. Something that I've discovered over the last 6 months since I started this company. A 1 milligram dose in a gummy is not the same as a 1 milligram dose in a fruiting body. And my hypothesis, which is supported by the types of molecules that make up the fungal biomass, mushrooms are essentially a time release pill. We do not have enzymes in our gut to digest chitin, which is the cell wall of fungal biomass. So all of the degradation that takes place in the stomach and the gut is through the acidity of our stomach. So the acid in our gut is going to break the mushroom down slowly and slowly release the alkaloid content of the mushroom over a period of time. Whereas you take a gummy and it has 1 milligram in it because it's been tested and we know it has 1 milligram of psilocin in it, or say 1.3 milligrams of psilocybin because there's a conversion factor there. You can feel 1 milligram in a gummy. You will not feel 1 milligram in an average potent mushroom.
So it comes on a lot faster, too.
Yes, you're basically getting all of the alkaloid dissolving immediately. You get this full milligram going into your bloodstream all at the same time. It's going to hit your receptors and cause an effect. So what I'm saying is for people out there, if they start getting a hold of gummies, go easy first.
Your mileage may vary.
Your mileage may vary. Take less than more initially. And if it's been lab tested, that'll give you a really good metric for your, dosing yourself. And I think with cannabis, that's been one of the coolest things is people like, okay, I know what 1 milligram, 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams is going to do to me now.
So let's talk about what's in that gummy, right? Not the actual gummy and the sugar itself, but, if what's in the gummy is not pulverized and powdered mushroom, it means that there is an extraction happening first, and then the result of that extraction is what's going into the gelatin process. What is that extraction?
It can vary. So a lot of people are using 100% ethanol or grain alcohol because for one, it's you're allowed to consume it. And for number two, it's easy to evaporate off. So this is something I've actually been helping a lot of people with their product development. I've been kind of doing consulting for people, which I'm definitely open to doing if anybody's interested. But because I have tons of extraction experience both in cannabis and in mushrooms and in plant material in general, because I've done that my whole life in the lab and as a recreational cannabis user. You can extract with water. You can extract with acidified water. Add citrus juice or something. You can extract with methanol, ethanol, acetic acid. However, you want to be able to, obviously, people don't use methanol when they're doing products, like you're making anything to be consumed. I use methanol in the lab because it's the best one for extraction for quantitation. I would say the best solvent to use for extracting mushrooms is 100% ethanol. So grain alcohol, you don't want to use lab 100% ethanol because these are cut with really nasty adulterants to remove the last bit of water. So Everclear is the best if you're at home and you're not sure what to use. And the great thing about alcohol, especially 100% alcohol, is with very mild heat, you can boil that off. So say you have an ounce of mushroom material that you want to extract as much as the psilocin and psilocybin out as alkaloids. So you will do a mechanical extraction, you grind it up, you can put it in a vessel, you can just shake it with a shaker, you can use a vortex, you can use a more powerful method or like ultrasonication or some way to get the alkaloids out of the mushroom. Then you filter your biomass out and you have this liquid with your mushroom extract. Now, fortunately, the alkaloids are pretty good, well resistant to mild heat. So you can add, 80, 90, 100 degree Fahrenheit heat to this alcohol extract and boil it off until it's reduced to whatever volume you want. And then you'd add a little bit of water, and then you boil off the rest of the ethanol, and you have all of your alkaloids in distilled water. And then you have a clean extract. No harmful compounds, unless there's something in the mushrooms you didn't know about, unless there's something in your solvent you didn't know about. But that's the cleanest way to produce a psilocybin extract. And that also gives you control over concentration as well. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and if that's how they are doing it, often when they're making these edibles, that's great. But also, that is a pretty simple process. That is something that a citizen scientist or a home user would be able to do as well.
100%. And that's kind of why I said it, because mostly what I think people are doing is they're kind of afraid to work with solvents, which, very understandable. But just pure grain alcohol is totally safe. And a lot of people, I believe, are trying to extract in water. And they're unable to reach these higher concentrations. And there's other tricks you can do too, right? I said you have an ounce of mushrooms, you extract into, 100 milliliters of a solution. You can filter that biomass out, take that sample that you have your extract in and use a fresh mushroom batch to re-extract, right? Because the solvent has a certain capacity to hold alkaloids, and you're never going to saturate that solution with one extraction. So that's another way you can increase the concentration of your extraction, by using the same solvent or water on fresh batches of biomass. Right? And then you combine that with the alcohol thing, then you can achieve really high concentrations and be able to make gummies or any kind of product by just diluting a little bit of it out.
That's the same way that I get my cannabis tinctures for myself for treating my brain injury up to the numbers that I want them to be, so I don't have to take like freaking 5, 6, 8 squirts, right? I'll do not a single, not a double, but a triple maceration. So introduce the same ethanol to fresh plant material 3 times.
Yes, exactly.
And what did you call it? Its carrying capacity? Whatever, it wasn't supposed to be a quiz, but the total amount of cannabinoids the ethanol can hold, because that's where I want it to be, right? I want it to be at the highest. So
the saturation point, essentially.
Yeah, so I don't have to take in any more Everclear or whatever the ethanol is that I'm using for it.
Right, and some people, especially recovered alcoholics or people that don't consume alcohol, they don't want that.
Yeah.
So you need to have an alternative, and luckily we can boil off the solvent pretty easy. And one thing I want to add to that real quick is I've seen studies where people treat the psilocybin alkaloids up to 60 degrees Celsius, which is 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And even with, relatively short treatments, 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, you don't get much degradation. So that's why you can heat these up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit and get almost no degradation if it's for a short time. You could also institute a rotovap, which is a rotating evaporator we use in the lab with mild heat. And that, if you've got the money to buy a rotovap, for example, that will go even faster. So there's tools out there to be able to do this.
I know that you've already said that you're not a mushroom cultivator, so you may not have anything to say about this question, but people will indeed be curious if you have come across any ways that cultivators can increase their potency in their growing bins, perhaps from a conversation with a client of yours or something, because people are always looking to increase potency, and clearly getting good genetics is probably the number one thing. But do you have anything else to add?
The one thing that comes to mind is I've heard people talk about CO2 levels. I believe CO2 levels are important for triggering fruiting body formation. And so I would imagine that the air composition, oxygen to CO2 ratio, and temperature are probably super important. I saw this really interesting post last night on Instagram that Paul Stamets put out, and he was saying that the temperature of the mushroom is cooler than its surroundings. And so it has like this endothermic behavior when the fruiting body is forming. And by endothermic, I mean it actually is able to absorb heat because it's cooler
like a
than
heat
its
sink.
surrounding.
It's like a heat sink.
Yeah. So an exothermic chemical reaction produces heat, and an endothermic reaction sucks heat out away from the reaction. So, for example, when you mix like acetonitrile and water together, which is the solvents I use in the lab for analytics, it gets cold. And you have to let it warm up to room temperature before you use it. That's an endothermic reaction. So this chemical reaction occurs, and then this mass now absorbs heat from the environment because the reaction like costs that biomass heat, or that mass, not biomass. But yeah, so, temperature, CO2, oxygen are probably the first metrics I would look at. But again, that's a hypothesis based on very limited information.
Good enough. We'll take that. This is a little bit of a fanboy question, but what varieties are you seeing consistently getting high potency results? I mean, online, just based on people's talking, I think that most people would put, whatever version of a penis envy at the top of that list. But you're in a unique place because you're interacting with people who are growing a wide variety, and you're seeing the test results. I think I'll just stop there. What are you seeing?
Yeah. The most potent mushroom I've seen so far is an ape, which I believe is a penis envy variety.
Albino penis envy. Yep.
Yep. And I've actually seen some variability in different apes, but the highest potency I've seen so far is 1.8% dry weight, and these beautiful apes that are just bluish and fat and beautiful. So that's one thing. I almost said something earlier about people's visual appeal to mushrooms and comparing it to how people just freak out about cannabis flowers. But I know there's some mushroom geeks out there that totally love just looking at the different morphologies of these fungi, and I find it super interesting as well. But you can definitely see some people thinking, oh, a cannabis flower is way more beautiful than a mushroom, but I think that's in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. But what I see when I look at these amazing natural organisms that we have, I see chemistry factories, right? Like this unbelievable ability to produce these chemicals that nature is providing, and it's so interesting too if you think about why plants are chemical factories. And it's a pretty simple answer. They can't run away. They can't run away from their predators, so they have to defend themselves chemically. And then plants and fungi have been on this planet for so long, they've had plenty of time to evolve mechanisms for defense, which are super broad. They've also had time to evolve molecules that affect organisms in other ways, which is what we get to benefit from, which is, I find absolutely fascinating, that these completely different organisms produce molecules that affect our brain chemistry. That just blows my mind.
Right on. So let's go ahead and take our second commercial break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about how the new existence of mushroom analytics is actually changing mushroom pricing in the underground. So we're going to take this short break. We'll be right back. You're listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is biochemist George Sellhorn. One of the reasons why no-till cannabis growing is so valued by farmers is because the mycelium networks in the soil remain established from year to year. And we know these fungal networks are essential because they are the nutrient superhighways that extend far and wide in the substrate to feed your plants. The trouble with growing in new living soils or blended cocoa substrates is that it takes most of the plant's life just to create these mycelium highways. Dinomyco endomycorrhizal fungi inoculant reduces that time and gets your plant eating a wider array of nutrients faster. And it's 3 times the concentration of the other popular brand in the US at 900 propagules per gram of 2 fungal species selected specifically for cannabis cultivation. Dinomyco is the result of 30 years of research and trials at the Volcani Agricultural Research Institute in Israel. It has also been vigorously trialed by cannabis and food growers across the U.S. Dinomyco is now available at grow shops and on Amazon in the United States. I love using Dynamyco to both speed up the growth of the mycelium networks in the soil, but also as a biostimulant to make clone cuttings more virile. You can see side-by-sides showing the comparative growth on their Instagram at Dynamyco. If you demand reliable growing results and appreciate the importance of an active root zone in creating a thriving plant, I encourage you to check out dynamyco.com and use the store locator to find out where you can get yours. That's dynomyco.com. Shaping Fire listeners can get 10% off any size of Dynamyco on Amazon or dynamyco.com by using the discount code SHAPINGFIRE, one word, no caps. Whether you are starting with new beds or pots, or if you want to add some zing to tired soil, choose Dynamyco to maximize your plant's potential. Dynamyco Endomycorrhizal Inoculant. For decades, Americans have enjoyed cannabis flowers in joints and bongs and bowls. And now, with the normalization of cannabis use increasing across the country, we have the opportunity to enjoy smoking cannabis luxuries that simply were not attainable before. North Coast hand rolls, blunts, cannons, rosin-infused donuts, and cannagars available in the state of Michigan. North Coast focuses on flavor over everything else. Instead of growing their own flower, North Coast goes out into the cultivation community and creates relationships with the best growers, working with the best new cannabis varieties available. Surely, heavy THC is a factor, but North Coast focuses on aroma, complex terpene profiles, and taste that continues throughout the entire smoking experience. The North Coast team curates flowers like others curate art. They seek out the best talent, build relationships, helps them take their product to the highest levels, and then buys their well-cured flowers in order to hand-roll them just for you. I really like their hand-blown glass tips. And North Coast has branched out beyond cannagars into rosin solventless THCA diamonds and exceptional hash rosin carts for on-the-go cannabis connoisseurs too. North Coast provides you with attainable luxury, offering you an ultra-premium smoking experience at a price that seems reasonable and repeatable. To find out more about North Coast's line of cannabis products, visit their Instagram at northcoast.rolling. That's northcoast.rolling. And when in Michigan, ask for North Coast at your favorite shop. North Coast. After you've caught up on the latest Shaping Fire episodes, do you sometimes wish there was more cannabis education available to learn? Well, we got you. Shaping Fire has a fabulous YouTube channel with content not found on the podcast. When I attend conventions to speak or moderate panels, I always record them and bring the content home for you to watch. The Shango Los YouTube channel has world-class speakers including Zoe Sigmund's lecture, Understanding Your Endocannabinoid System, Kevin Jodrey of Wonderland Nursery talking about breeding cannabis for the best terpene profile, Frenchie Canoli's Lost Art of the Hashishin presentation, Nicholas Mahmood on regenerative and polyculture cannabis growing, Dr. Sunil Agarwal on the history of cannabis medicine around the world, Eric Vlosky and Josh Rutherford on solventless extraction, and Jeff Lowenfels on the soil food web. There are several presentations from Dr. Ethan Russo on terpenes and the endocannabinoid system too. While there, be sure to check out the 3 10-part Shaping Fire Sessions series, one with Kevin Jodrey, one with Dr. Ethan Russo, and one with Jeff Lowenfels. And even my own presentations on how to approach finding your dream job in cannabis and why we choose cannabis business even though the risks are so high. As of today, there's over 200 videos that you can check out for free. So go to youtube.com/ShangoLos or click on the link in the newsletter. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shango Los, and my guest today is biochemist George Sellhorn. So one of the interesting, impacts from the recent existence of mushroom labs is how it is impacting price in the both the underground mushroom market and also in the just blossoming, soon to be licensed market. Because up until labs existed, a psilocybin mushroom was a psilocybin mushroom. They were generally the same. Some had their, people had their preferences because maybe they had a good trip on it one time, or they like how they looked more. And then people would be like, oh, these tend to be stronger than these other ones. But it was really just conjecture and very anecdotal on a each person had their own opinion, and there was no way to compare and contrast. Enter mushroom labs now. And so now we actually know what's in them. And so there's this new variety. Up until now it was, people's preference, and maybe the mushroom had something desirable about it, like it was albino or leucistic or oh cool, it looks like penises, which is, right, kind of a novel thing too. So people were making decisions on, aesthetic choices. But now you can put them in a lab and say, all right, this black cap albino penis envy is the most potent thing that we've gotten tested, versus this Brazilian, which is beautiful and easy to grow and has these other attributes that we're attracted to, but it's only 7%, or not 0.7%. It's only 70% as potent as the ape, for example. I just made that number up. Right. So, but just for the example, and so that is now impacting pricing at the street and manufacturing level, because people are starting to charge more for ultra potent mushrooms like these apes, and that's very interesting. What is your experience like behind the scenes with your customers? Because it's getting to be a bit like cannabis, where the higher the THC, the more likely it is to be sold. Well, the potency of mushrooms is now becoming related to the price as well, from both people who are taking it for a spiritual experience and for people who are planning on doing an extraction and putting them into a bunch of gummies or something.
Right. Yeah, I didn't even know that was happening, to be honest, because I don't purchase mushrooms. You're in the lab, yeah, right. Yeah, people pay me to take their mushrooms and test them. So that's actually fascinating. And, it makes sense, actually, because at least with mushrooms, we can touch on the cannabis stuff. I have a pretty strong opinion about that one if you want to hear it. But with mushrooms, I've tested stuff as low as 0.2% all the way to 1.8%. So that's, ninefold difference in potency. And, if you go to a bar and you want to buy a Budweiser that's whatever, I don't know, 1.5, whatever the percent of a Budweiser is, you're going to pay a low amount of money. And then say there's like some 8.5% Belgian. You're probably going to pay more for that beer, right? Mm-hmm. Because alcohol is, like, we know what it does. It has a linear effect. You drink more, you get more drunk, right? With mushroom alkaloids, you take more, you have a more interesting experience. This is like linear. The more you take, the higher you get. So it makes sense in the mushroom world. And the only problem there is, are people going to be saying, oh, this is an ape, when it's really like a way less potent mushroom? So, ask for the lab tests if they're charging you based on potency.
Yeah, it's interesting how suddenly COAs are very relevant in mushrooms now too.
Yeah, I've had people requesting them being made. Yep.
And it's interesting, there are arbitrage opportunities as well in this, because if you are manufacturing, you may not necessarily choose an ape mushroom because they are at the even though the potency is the highest,
100%,
it is also the highest price. And so right. There would be good arguments to be made that you're looking for, in a manufacturing environment, you right. may be looking for a balance between, what mushroom has got the right balance of potency, availability, easiness to cultivate, and then easiness to, break down and use, right?
Yeah, you're 100% right.
And so most potent mushroom is not necessarily going to be best mushroom for manufacturing, and these realizations are just coming to the industry, and it's really interesting to watch them sort themselves out.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, because if you're running a business, it's all about efficiency. Like, how much does it cost me to do this, and how much do I get back, and how much product can I make from it? So I could very easily see a scenario where there's a 1% mushroom. It grows fast. It's really easy to grow, like you say. It's maybe it grows twice as fast as a mushroom that's 1.5%. You know what I mean? So it would be better to grow the 1%. You get more biomass, and then your extraction efficiency is better with the slightly lower potent mushroom. It's going to be, everybody's process is going to have to be worked out in that manner, and that's what I would suggest people do, is just don't go right off the bat and buy the most expensive potent mushroom. Get a couple different potency batches, see how much it costs you to make your product, and then make a correct decision.
So earlier in the second set, we were talking about what part of the mushroom tends to be the most potent, and you told me about the single test case you have done where it was actually the junction of the stem to the cap that tested highest, which was a really interesting insight. And then as we worked our way out of the question, I just mentioned that people argue quite a bit online about whether or not it's the cap or the stem. And you said, yeah, there's a lot of variability, and we moved on. But I want to come back to that because, you are the chemist, and you are the person who is, doing these tests. And granted, most of your tests are on homogenized mushroom, right? So the cap and the stem are all mixed together. But I'm thinking that you have something to say, even if it is there's no hard and fast rule. I just want to get your thoughts on stem versus cap potency generally across all psilocybe mushrooms.
That's such a difficult question to answer. I would feel comfortable if I tested at least 10 different mushrooms and looked at caps and stems and stuff, but I've only done it once. Like an N of 1 is a classic example of not enough data to make a decision. But there's, over the years, people have looked at this in different academic groups or different parts of the world where they're allowed to do this work, and in general the theme is that the caps are more potent. So I would probably lean to that being true. There's always exceptions to rules, like where we saw the guy have a more potent stem the other day. But in general, I would say the caps probably do have more alkaloid than the stem.
So,
especially
if there was
like
a rule of
mature mushroom,
right on it, that makes sense. So your rule of thumb would be caps, but we know the variability between varieties is so significant that don't put too much weight on the rule of thumb. Yeah, very good.
The best thing to do is just grind it all up, in my opinion. Grind everything you have into a single powder, and then it's going to be pretty consistent. Because I've had another customer where he took like a pound and ground the whole thing up, and then he sampled it 3 different areas and called that A, B, and C. And then he did that for 4 months. Every month he did a sampling like A, B, C, right? And so he was looking for degradation over time and consistency of sampling. And found some really cool stuff, like the sampling and the consistency was highly cool. Everything was really close. Like every test I did was right around 6 milligrams per gram, so 0.6%. And over time, he barely lost anything. So he had a really good storage condition. So if you're looking for consistency, homogenize.
I think that the time when it comes up most of the time is when there is a sale taking place, because so often a purchaser, whether or not it is somebody who is trying to establish a business in Oregon, or if it's in like the traditional neighborhood market, there's always people want the caps because they look cool and they're kind of like ceremonially dope. But so often, if you're the last person to buy mushrooms from your connection, there might be a lot of stems in the bottom, and so you might end up with mostly stems and a few caps. And the fact that we don't really know does help the position of the seller. So I think that's when it usually comes up, because anybody who's growing their own and it's not changing hands, we're just going to homogenize it, like you said. So it seems to be either in a licensed market or about to be licensed market where there is a professional cultivator selling to a professional manufacturer, or when you're just getting mushrooms from your homie.
Right.
Yeah. Let's hit on the storage of mushrooms next, because there's the answer to how best to store your mushrooms has really evolved over the years, and very much so over the last 3 years. And so, when I was in college back in the early 90s, we were told to put it in a Ziploc and put it in the freezer. And, that seemed to work, but I'm understanding now that there's a lot more people doing this research now, and it's evolved. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the varieties of storing our mushrooms and how we can get the most longevity about them? And probably in your answer, include a little bit about what causes mushrooms to degrade too.
Sure. Yeah. So remarkably, the best way to store mushrooms is in the dark, sealed in a bag, at about 60 to 65 degrees and, moderate humidity. I've seen people do freeze-thaw studies, like you said, in the freezer, put them in the refrigerator and store them just at room temperature, which would be a little bit warmer than 60, 65, 70, 75 degrees. And pretty much the best way to do it to maintain alkaloid levels is cool and in the dark, right? So,
do we want to remove as much oxygen as possible?
Yes.
If
that's where I was just going. Yeah.
Oh, all right. So using like a
vacuum sealer.
That's what I'm trying to get to. Yeah,
yeah.
That's a good move then.
Yeah, absolutely. So the primary issue is oxidation. So if you take away the oxygen, then you're going to have way less opportunity for your mushrooms to degrade. Light and heat and oxygen are your enemies when it comes to this. So oxygen is the molecule that does the damage, but light and heat will speed it up. So, and the reason why the freezer doesn't work all that great is when you freeze thaw biomass, whether it be tissue from an animal, plant, bacteria, fungi, when you freeze thaw something, you cause some of the cells to lyse or burst. And when you do that, you're going to expose the contents to oxygen. So that freeze thaw in and out of the freezer, every time you do it, you're going to burst some of the cells, and then that's going to lead to the degradation. In the refrigerator, it's probably a moisture thing as well. So moisture also could be a problem. So if you don't fully dry your mushroom, you put it in the fridge, the change in temperature is going to cause condensation. If the biomass absorbs any of that water, it will facilitate degradation as well. Whereas you keep them in a nice, consistent, dry, dark environment and it's cool, that seems to be the best way to preserve your mushroom potency over time.
So you suggested keeping them in a low 60s dark spot in a bag. Let's talk about that bag, because you may have just kind of said that generally. There's a difference of an opinion between a paper bag, because some people say they need to breathe, but I think that's just the opposite because of the oxidation aspect.
Correct.
And then there's
if they're
other
fully
people
dry, you don't need to breathe.
Right on. And then there's other people who talk about either using plastic or because most plastic that's not a vacuum seal breathes. Some people are suggesting glass jars are the way to go. So what is the vessel that you recommend?
Actually, if you want to be really anal about it and give yourself little to no, the best opportunity to preserve your material, a glass jar that seals would be great. Yeah. And also, if you want to go even a step further, you can take an inert gas like nitrogen or argon and blanket the vessel with that, and it pushes out all the oxygen. Now, that's going a little far and beyond. Most home people aren't going to do that, but in the laboratory or in a business, you absolutely would want to do that, because you'll get much longer shelf life if you purge the oxygen from the storage vessel.
A way to do that cheap at home without adding the inert, without adding an inert gas is, for these food fresh vacuum packs.
Right.
They've got these mason jar lid adapters,
Absolutely.
which is what I use for my cannabis.
Absolutely.
And so, I know the stuff that I'm going to smoke soon, and then I know the stuff that I've just taken out of cure that's probably going to sit there until I get to it in 2 or 3 months, right?
Indeed.
And so I put it in a largemouth mason jar, and I think I paid like $20 for this adapter, and it sucks the all of the air out of it. And so I would think that would also be a win for when I have mushrooms.
100%. And filling up the vessel with as much material as possible so there's no room for air. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. Nope. That's exactly the way you would do it if you're covering all your bases.
All right. So let's talk about time for degradation for the most common way of keeping mushrooms versus the crazy way that we just described for perfection. So, most people, they're going to get their mushrooms in a Ziploc, and then they're going to bring them home. And let's not use freezer or refrigerator, because we've already suggested that no one should be doing that. So they want to keep it in a cool, dark place. So fine, it's good. Let's just put it under the bed. So it's dark, it's cool, and it's in a Ziploc bag. And let's say that the mushrooms, when you receive them, let's say that they were harvested 2 weeks ago, and they were dried properly, and you've got a very short supply chain between the cultivator and me as the mushroom enthusiast. All right. So in that scenario, how quickly are my mushrooms under the bed going to degrade?
Are we talking? We have a nice cool. It's like a 60, 65 degrees.
Yeah. Let's say the temperature's right and it's dark.
It's slow. I can give you an example that was not perfectly stored, but when I first started setting up the lab here and doing my R&D and getting my methods started, I had a grower friend give me a nice bag of homogenized material so that I had a good amount of material to go back and check, so I could work on consistency, right? Trying to make sure I was getting accurate results over time. Now, I had that material, and I did all my initial development about last September. December, January is when I did that work. And then I tested that stuff about a month ago. So it was about 6 months where it sat probably closer to 70 degrees. Just in a plastic bag in my closet in my bedroom, right? And it went from about 0.7% to about 0.56%. So let me really quick, what is that?
It's around
that is that's about 80%. So it's like a 20% loss in 6 months. And that's not too bad.
No, that's actually way better than I thought it was going to be.
It was elevated temperature. So if you keep it at 60 degrees, and that probably could have warmed up in there above that if it got warm, like a few weeks. It's been warm recently, so it could have accelerated a little bit towards the end there. But that guy that I did the study with, over 4 months, I think the potency changed by like 2%. Mm-hmm. So very little.
Yeah, very insignificant. One of my friends who's a cultivator, he was very concerned about this last year during the Pacific Northwest heat dome when it got to 114 where he lives in eastern Washington. And, he said, other people he knew were going to get ice in order to, keep food or their pets or whatever cool. And, he kind of, how a double boiler, you've got the heat source on on the bottom and then a secondary thing. He was actually taking all his storage of dried mushrooms and putting them in a vacuum packed bag, and then put it in a cooler that had all ice in the bottom, but then was sealed and then was on top. And that's how he's like, I don't know what the science says about how quickly these are going to lessen potency. He says, but I want it to be 0. And so he's all like, I may be sweating my ass off during the heat dome. He says, but my mushrooms won't. And I thought that was a pretty novel approach.
That's a pretty clever approach, yeah. Because what he did was smart, because it allows him to put his mushrooms in the air above the cold. Whereas if he would have laid it directly on the ice, that super cold temperature probably would have caused some condensation to form inside there. So it's almost like he just made a little bit of air conditioning for his mushrooms,
Yeah, and he describes it as a double boiler, and it's weird. Even though it's a radically different application of that idea, I totally got what he meant. I'm like, oh, that's brilliant.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
he's letting the ice at the bottom cool the chamber above. And it's not going to drop it down to the ice temperature, but it's going to keep it much cooler than ambient. So that's pretty clever. Like I said, I like it.
Right on. So let's talk about, since we're talking about mushroom analytics labs, and, primarily Shaping Fire talks about entheogens and, the evolution of mind and all. But there are other mushrooms that people are all hot about now, generally put in a, Chinese medicinal groups like, reishi and turkey tail and lion's mane and all of these other mushrooms that sometimes we use in cooperation with psilocybe mushrooms for this ailment or that. But also just taking them for general health seems to be pretty appropriate.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the awarenesses that you have testing these other mushrooms as well? I'm assuming that you don't just test psilocybe, since you've talked about these other mushrooms and you have such intimate details with them. I'm assuming that there's people who are formulating a lion's mane extract or something who's coming to you as well. And what are you seeing as far as variability in the potency of these mushrooms? Because unless they're really degraded, they all look the same, and there's no real way for us as a consumer to know whether or not this particular lion's mane product is as strong as this other one as a consumer.
Right. Yeah, this is the direction that we're going. I'm in the process. I just got the cordyceps testing set up. However, the testing for a lot of these other mushrooms is a lot more complicated. Sometimes you can use the HPLC UV, but for most of these, you're going to need a mass spectrometer. And, those are exceedingly expensive, over $100,000 for the right machine to do that testing. And I plan on going there. I want to turn this business into a fully functional mushroom lab, not just a psychedelic lab. And I've been approached by customers for things like mescaline, DMT, ayahuasca, alkaloids. People are asking me about testing for all these things. So in the long run, I would like to be able to test for all of that. And the coolest thing about being in Oregon is with the decriminalization laws, we can test these as long as we have small amounts, so it's really cool. It actually gives you an advantage of being in Oregon that the other jurisdictions that only legalize psilocybin, they're not going to be able to touch.
Yeah, right on. That makes a lot of sense. And there's so much demand. I mean,
it's huge.
Even though cannabis is not normalized yet, especially at the federal level, all these other entheogens that we love and humans have been using forever, they're coming in the door right behind cannabis in the same way. Still going to be politically and legally messy for a while, but everybody knows that the doors are open and
it's cracked open.
Pandora's box.
The snowball's rolling downhill.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a question about fruiting body versus mycelium potency, because this is probably one of the most asked questions I'm asked when talking to folks about Chinese mushrooms and such. There are people who fall on the it's okay to put mycelium in the caps in the way that Stamets does for his products. And then there are people who believe that mycelium-based medicine is snake oil, and it's actually only the fruiting bodies that should be used in kind of more of a real mushrooms company kind of way. And someone's opinion really tends to fall on the fact of whether or not what their personal preference is. But you're an analyst, and so I wanted to hear what your thoughts are about whether or not we should be buying products that are made from a fruiting body or from mycelium when we're talking about non-psilocybe medicinal mushrooms.
Yeah, this is super interesting, and this is the point where opinions don't count. Science counts. When you have data showing that there's molecules present in a certain part of the biomass, I don't care what someone's opinion is. If we know that lion's mane mycelium makes hercinone A, or aranacine A, and the fruiting body doesn't, then you can go eating the fruiting body all day and you're not going to be getting the aranacines. You'll get the hercinones, which I believe that's correct, that the aranacines are typically found in the mycelium and the hercinones in the fruit. If I have that switched, I apologize to everybody who knows that off the top of their head. But this is where the science rules. You have a good lab, a good scientist that knows how to do all of the stuff properly and has the proper controls and the proper identification of these molecules. And you can even start looking at this on a genetic level too. You could start looking for gene expression in the mycelium versus the fruiting body, and that's another layer of evidence that it's being produced, right? So you can find the gene in both the fruiting body and the mycelium because the DNA is consistent from, doesn't matter the structure of the mushroom or the mycelium, but the turning on of that gene does matter. So there's ways that we can look at that. And then obviously, if the molecule is present so for example, we grow some lion's mane mycelium, and we have a boatload of biomass, and we pull that out, we extract it, and we identify hercinone A using mass spectrometry. It's there. Right? So, and then you go and you have the fruiting body of lion's mane, you grind that up, you do your analytics, maybe aranacine isn't there. So all I'm saying is there's different molecules made in mycelium and fruiting bodies for different species, and I've heard Paul Stamets say this ad nauseum, but some people just don't want to listen. If you don't want to follow the data and the science, that's your right, but it's not going to be correct in terms of what the contents are of those extractions or those biomasses.
I think it's also one of the reasons why we need to make this information more available to people, right? Because I don't think that anybody, or very few people are intentionally making decisions that are anti-science. I think that most people just would never know where to find the data that you're talking about of people testing mycelium versus fruiting body. This information is just hard to get.
You need to be a scientist. You need to be able to go onto PubMed and not just find articles that fit what you're looking for, but be able to go into the article and read it from a critic's perspective. And, because every time a scientist reads a scientific paper, you're putting that data to the test. You're saying, does the data that people have presented in this paper convince me of what they're trying to convince me? And a lot of times you'll have a scientist read a paper and be like, I don't buy it. That data's not convincing. Look at what they did here. They're changing their axes to get you to think there's a bigger effect. There's a lot of subtle things scientists can do to trick a non-expert. So that's why it's dangerous for your average person to go into PubMed, read a science paper, and be like, oh, this is what this means. It's dangerous to do that because a lot of times, unfortunately, there are plenty of scientists out there that have an agenda and they're being paid by a company to get a certain answer, and they'll do everything they can to support it. Look at the food industry, for goodness gracious.
Well, we run into that in cannabis all the time because
100%.
people are reading these tests, and even though, and certainly people are fudging with their graphs, but at the most basic level, you really have to study whether or not they used isolate or a whole plant resin in the patient study, because they act differently. You can't just say, oh, we use 200 milligrams of CBD for this lupus patient, because 200 milligrams of isolate is different than 200 milligrams of CBD in, a whole plant resin.
Crude oil.
Yeah, totally. And there's reasons for there's reasons to use either, right? So even though I'm a whole plant guy, I'm not trying to diss the isolate. You just have to know what your goal is and understand what was done in the study.
100%, and there's a really good example for that too. With CBD isolate versus a CBD extract. Children with Dravet syndrome, they need CBD isolate. Like the CBD is what actually helps the seizures. You don't need that other stuff. And plus, when you have all that other stuff in there, you might have to give the kid a little bit of THC, which you might not want to do to a 5-year-old or something, So there's absolutely applications for isolates versus crudes. If you're going at something like a cancer or multiple sclerosis or some inflammatory thing, you don't want isolate, because all those other things in there are going to have different effects and synergize and attack the broad symptoms that someone that has cancer or MS or something like that, as opposed to something very specific like a Dravet syndrome, which is a very specific kind of epilepsy. So, and we transfer this to the mushroom world, and I guarantee there's going to be ailments that, for example, depression, psilocybin, pure psilocybin, isolated in the lab, even maybe synthesized and used as a medicine for depression, that works 100%. It's like you don't need like a whole mushroom extract to pull that off. So, but there's definitely going to be something out there where we talked about earlier with the 5 or 6 different alkaloids we're finding in psilocybe that are measurable by UV, HPLC UV. Maybe a different proportion of those might have a better effect on PTSD than depression, or a better effect on any of these other ailments that we're seeing psychedelic mushrooms being effective on. Can we get an even better result by changing the ratio of baeocystin to psilocin?
I'm really looking forward to us, actually having the research behind these other components of the mushroom, so that we can start even having this whole plant, whole mushroom conversation. Because at this point, anybody who says that they know is blowing smoke, because the research isn't there. I respect smart people's hunches, but we're only in the early days of learning what's in the mushroom, and so to say that we know all the ramifications is just unrealistic.
Yeah, the hunches and hypotheses put us on the road to discovery, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's kind of like the same thing we're going through with cannabis, right? We all started with bro science, and now we have to individually replace what we think we know with new things as the research, it gets established. So.
Of course, yeah.
Right on. Well, then let's wrap up here. So, George, thank you so much for sharing your unique expertise. With there only being 3, municipalities, or not municipalities, but three jurisdictions in the country that it's legal-ish to do what you do at the state level, but it's still a Schedule I drug.
100%.
You have got perspective and experience that is just exceedingly difficult to find. And it took me a while to find you, and then it took you a while to be comfortable to be a little more public. So I appreciate you choosing to share your knowledge with us, and I wish you the best of luck on this research and the and your applications, however you use it. So thank you so much for being on Shaping Fire.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been super incredible, and it's the first time I've ever done anything like this, so it was great. I had some closing thoughts there for a second, but they may have just escaped me. Other than Oh, yeah, I remember. So, real briefly, if I could just kind of give a brief history of my interest in this. I started my psychedelic journey pretty young. I took LSD for the first time at 15 years old and got very heavily into it for a couple of years, which had an enormous impact on my life for the better, actually. And my younger days were pretty wild. I grew up a skateboarder with a single parent that was a business owner, so there was a lot of freedom, and I got into a lot of things young, and I was going down a track that probably wouldn't have been really beneficial to my longevity. And after experiencing psychedelics, mostly LSD and then a little bit of mushrooms towards the end there, by the time I was finishing high school, it completely changed me and put me on the academic track. I found some better people to be friends with. I got this amazing young lady that I started dating, and we were together for 10 years, and she helped steer me in the right direction. I ended up going to college, going to graduate school, getting a PhD and all this stuff. So I really strongly believe that the combination of cannabis and psychedelics helped put me where I am today. And so I've been involved with this counterculture for my whole life since I was about 15, and I'm 45 now. So for 30 years, I've been involved at the edge of counterculture as a skateboarder, as a cannabis person, and very, very bullish on the ability of psychedelics to do positive things to people. And now we're finally here all these years later where we're given the tools. I happen to get the education, and now I can be put in the position to help a bunch of people overcome challenges that might provide them with a better life down the road. So that's kind of why I'm here, how I got here, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to share what I know about mushrooms and the analytics and the science behind it, and I'm really excited to see where all this goes in the future.
Well, thank you so much, George. So if you want to follow along with George and his research, there is but one place to go, and that is the Flourish Labs Instagram account. And so that's at Flourish, FLOURISH, and then underscore labs, LABS, underscore Oregon. So if you happen to live in Oregon and you are looking for analytics, you can reach out to George that way. But if, like me, you've got no need for analytics, but you're very interested in keeping up with the science and his research, there's the place to go. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you would leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news, exclusive videos, and giveaways. On the Shaping Fire website, you will also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. Be sure to follow on Instagram for all original content not found on the podcast. That's at Shaping Fire and at Shango Los on Instagram. Be sure to check out the Shaping Fire YouTube channel for exclusive interviews, farm tours, and cannabis lectures. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.